Today I would like to continue my series on the Caro Kann. So last time we went into sort of the old main line, which was knight c3, and we looked at some of the ideas there. I mean, it didn't cover absolutely everything, but it should give a pretty good sense of how to play those positions and what the main opening theory is about. So today I'd like to go into what I believe is sort of the most important line of today, which is the advanced variation, which is e4, c6, d4, d5, and white plays e5, which takes a lot of space in the center and is trying to take the space and not let black get any counterplay for it. So this is somewhat similar to the advanced French, but there's two main differences. One, black's a little bit behind on development compared to the advanced French, where he's often a little bit ahead. And two, which is what we're going to try to bank on, is this bishop on c8 is not going to be blocked in by the pawn on e6. So there's two main moves here, bishop f5 and c5. C5 is interesting for sure, and black's results have been adequate here, but I don't entirely trust it. It looks very risky to me. Opening the center, it's before black might be ready. In any case, I'm not sure. I don't really recommend this move. Although I also don't have any prescribed refutation for any player playing white. That's your own job. But I'm going to recommend bishop f5, which is sort of a more positional move. And here, I think white has played, I think like at levels over 2,400 FIDE, white's played 13 different moves in this position. Maybe that's two, or maybe it was just 11. White has played a lot of moves here. He's played c4, he's played a3, he's played b3, he's played bishop d3, bishop e2, knight f3, knight e2, g4, h4, knight c3, knight d2, f4. He's played every single move under the sun. To cover every single one of these would take years, so we're not going to. But I'm sort of going to show you a little bit about how to approach the positions before we get into the moves that I think we do have to cover. So, first of all, the bishop exchange with bishop d3 happens in some lines with or without f4. Here I think there's a key motif that black should know. Let's say white plays, f4 would sort of be in the spirit of this kind of variation, but it's not the best move. But let's say f4, or even knight f3. We'll respond the same way. I think black should play this sort of nice strategic idea, queen a5 check, and the point is after bishop d2 to play queen a6. And with this move, black is going to encourage an exchange of queens, and I think if the queens come off, white's maybe had some attacking potential on the king side, and black will be able to transform to an endgame. And if white wants to avoid a queen exchange, he's going to have to give up the right to castle. And I think this is sort of a nice motif. And then he has something after like takes, castles, knight e7. Black will play c5, knight c6. He's got a very comfortable position. He can also put the knight on f5. Black has a very comfortable endgame without any serious weaknesses. So that's sort of what to do on like the bishop d3 or on f4 e6 bishop d3. There's also been some crazy lines like there's h4, which is a legitimate move. There's g4, which is not bad, but I'm not thrilled with it. After g4, like bishop d7 has been played by Anand, and he beat Shirov in 18 moves, but it's probably a good move. I think bishop e4 is quite sufficient. And like f3, bishop g6, and I think black has no problems at all here. The white pawns on the king side aren't really doing that much. If white plays h4, just h5. And there's some on like knight e2, e6, knight f4, hg4, and this position's a little messy, but you can take my word that black's better. So that's not to worry about. White could play like I guess knight e2 here, and then e6, knight f4, but I don't believe in this. Just after c5, it looks to me like, or queen h4 probably was hurting at some point too. This doesn't look very logical on white's perspective, and I think black should be quite fine. Other moves that are just kind of random, I'm trying to think. There's like c4. c4 I don't think is too interesting, just e6, and black's fine. In any case, basically white has two ways to approach this position. One is to try to play positionally, which will involve sort of putting a clamp down on c5 and trying to like advance the kingside pawns eventually maintain the space advantage. That's going to be the subject of our next video, and like the most accepted of these lines would be the short variation with like knight f3, e6, bishop e2. This is sort of like the most normal. But there's other lines too, like white can play bishop e3 to prevent c5, he can play knight d2 to b3. These are like the kind of moves that will sort of play like the more positional, try to prevent c5 and try to use the extra space, and I do think these are the most critical moves. But for this video, we're going to focus on sort of the aggressive moves and white trying to immediately create a mess all over the board for us to figure out what to do. So we already saw g4. Let's go to sort of its cousin with h4. Now, h4 is, it's kind of a tricky move. I mean, if black plays e6, he's losing a piece after g4. But black can respond with h5, and I think his position here is quite fine. White's been trying mainly c4 here. To be honest, I think the best move is bishop to g5. This is the most challenging. It's messy, but not so bad. Anyhow, it's very unexplored, so if any white players are looking into this line, I would suggest looking into bishop g5. But I also don't think we need to cover it because it's pretty similar to the rest. So let's say c4, e6, and I think black is just absolutely fine here. I don't see any problems at all. There's some interesting lines, like if white plays bishop g5 now, probably queen b6 is best, putting pressure on the b2 pawn. And black is quite happy, I think. Let's say queen d2, black should capture on c4. This is a pretty common motif to get this structure. Bishop takes c4 would not be a good move. Let's see if you guys can figure out what black's tactic here is. Give you a second. Alright, if you want more time, pause your videos. I know this isn't really like a tactics video, but anyhow, bishop takes b1 wins the game because black's going to play bishop b4. So, more likely white would have to play a move like knight c3. And after queen b4, white is going to have a very hard time recovering this pawn. He has some compensation, of course, but realistically, if black plays knight d7, b5, knight b6, he doesn't really have much in the way of weaknesses, and I think he has every reason to look at the future with a lot of confidence. So, that's not really an issue. More common is knight c3. Now, knight d7 was the main move for a while, but I wasn't quite a believer because I thought somehow after c takes d5 it was a little more pleasant for white. I wanted knight e7. I like this move. The point is I want to meet this with knight takes d5. I think this exchange of knights will heavily favor black because I want to put the other knight on c6, and I think in general trading off more pieces will be very helpful. So this is totally fine. More common is if white tries to do something a little bit more rash. Let's say bishop g5, and now knight d7, and say like knight e2. And the point of this is white is trying to play knight g3, kick some pieces backwards, and it's a little bit hard for black to develop. But I think after a couple accurate moves, black is quite fine. So first I'd recommend d takes c4, and now knight g3. Black is not able to save the pawn with b5 because after some knight e4, well, white is completely winning because knight d6 is on the way, and we can't move the e7 knight. But just f6, immediately kicking that bishop, and say like takes, and bishop moves back, and then bishop g6, takes, and like knight d5. Black is quite fine. He'll play knight b6, queen d7, castle's long. He doesn't have any serious weaknesses, and all his pieces are on decent squares. So there's a lot of ways to reach a position kind of like this, where you got this structure where white has the isolated d pawn, and black's loosened himself on the king side, which means he'll probably have to castle long. But in general, I think these positions are totally fine. I haven't really found anything that, in my analysis, that would bother me. So this isn't really a concern. I know this line is still gaining some popularity, and I do think it's a decent try, but it's not like something to be totally worried about. I'm just trying to think of other possibilities here. I know there's some other stuff, but in any case, you sort of have the bones of it, that your goal is to get to the structure where you get some like knight f3, knight d7, and like bishop g5. Your goal is to get this kind of structure. Takes, bishop e3, takes, knight b6, And same, bishop b3, queen d7, you put your knight on d5. This is really the structure you want with a queenside castle, and I think black has every reason to look into the future with a lot of confidence. So let's go back. I don't think this is a super aggressive line for white. And let's cover one that's a little bit more aggressive, which is knight to c3, which, I mean, okay, this is sort of a burn the bridges style move because positionally speaking, it makes no sense at all. Black plays e6, and if white were just to play a slow continuation, knight f3 after just c5, I mean, already white's center is coming under a lot of pressure because he'd really like to have the move c3 available. But yeah, that's not really an issue. Really what white is going to be trying to do is play the move g4 and immediately create problems for black on the king side. But I don't think these are really an issue. So bishop g6, now sort of the trademark h4 would just be nothing after h5. Black's already better. So white will play the move knight e2. And with this move, he's hoping to play h4, h5, knight f4, and get an attack going. Now, basically with the Caro Kann, in the advanced variation, oftentimes if white can get something like this going, it can be very dangerous. So I believe that in a principled way, we should, if he wants to get a full fight with us, instead of playing one of those more positional lines, we should not shy away from it with a move like knight d7. I think here it's time to fight. And there are two moves that I would recommend here, f6 and c5, both of which are looking for a fight, and both of which I think are playable. The only move I'm going to cover in this video is c5, but f6 I do think is a decent move. So after c5, white has two main options, h4 and bishop e3. If h4, I'd recommend h5, and now knight f4. And here I would just say bishop h7. You're going to lose a pawn. It's not the end of the world, but we're going to have some very good compensation. So knight takes h5, and now knight c6. There was some game, I want to say, I know Topolov was black, I want to say Shirov was white. But white's center is coming under a lot of pressure here, and it's very hard for him to hold it together. If he plays bishop b5, he plays cd, queen d4, knight e7, and now white has a couple tries here. He can play bishop g5, but after like queen a5, I think black is quite happy. a6 is also a reasonable move. For example, takes after a takes b5, ironically, I think black's just winning. Same with bishop takes c6, knight c6. If bishop d8, knight d4, black wins. Yeah, so a6 is probably the best move after bishop g5. And after like takes, I don't know, maybe white will play like queen a4, but just queen c7, and it looks to me like black has a lot of play coming. So a sort of weird move is bishop h6, trying to use the fact that gh6 is not playable on account of knight f6 mate, but common collective defense just shows rook g8, and white's actually close to losing here. Like, for example, castle's long, a6, sorry, not a5, that would be a bad move. a6, takes, and like, already queen a4, b5 is trapping the queen, or something like that, so like he plays queen d2. And black just plays like rook c8, queen a5, and he just gives checkmate. All of his pieces work together beautifully. So, that's not a problem at all. The most critical move after knight c6 is for white to take another pawn. And here I'd recommend, again, another just burn the bridges, bishop takes c5, let him take on g7, just you don't even care. And I think that black is totally fine. Like after takes, here, knight h5, we can play like knight takes e5, or actually probably even d4 is even stronger. And, I don't know, knight b5 or something, queen d5, and yeah, it was a huge initiative for black. I would not be concerned at all about him missing that one kingside pawn because he's not in any serious danger, and that it'll leave it open the h-file for his rook. All of his pieces are going to participate in the attack, and I think that white is under a lot of pressure. So I don't think that's super critical. There's some lines here where white tries to like pretend he's doing all right, but I don't believe them. You can look further into this on your own. I think I've pretty well covered that. Shown my opinion that black is doing extremely well. Much more critical is the move bishop to e3. And now, again, I'm going to recommend just kind of burn the bridges style. So I would suggest knight to c6. So this move, black's trying to make problems for white immediately in the center. White will capture on c5, I believe. And now knight takes d5 is maybe possible, but it's risky. After knight d4, bishop b5 check, f4, f5 is coming very quickly. I would be a bit concerned. So I'm going to recommend actually playing h5, which is more combative. And I think black's doing quite fine here. For example, I think like knight f4, bishop h7, and white cannot capture on h5 because of d4 winning a piece. I mean, even still, actually, it's white has some play after some kind of like knight b5 to d6, but I don't think it's sufficient. I would not recommend black to win a piece here with d4. I think after knight g6, fg6, I think white has very good compensation after, say, like queen d3, probably knight e7, then knight e4, hitting knight d6. This looks very risky to me, and I would not recommend it. But I do think bishop h7, just threatening to win a pawn next move, is quite fine. And black will play h takes g4 and have a fine position. For example, bishop b5, h g4, queen g4, and just like knight h6, put the knight on f5, queen on a5, and black is doing very, very well, despite being down a pawn. So more common, I believe, is move knight d4. I think it's f4, some kind of f4 takes and knight d4. And here we get a really crazy position after knight h6, knight cb5. I'm pretty sure this is how it goes, but I might be messing up the move order. And like takes, knight d6, takes. And it's very rare in chess for you to see a position where each side has just a complete domination of one color complex. But we have that here. I mean, the dark squares completely belong to white, and the light squares completely belong to black. And these positions are rare and hard to assess, but I believe black should be all right here. The white pawn on d6 is a huge thorn in black's side, but at the same time, I don't really see a great way for white to make progress, and black can hope to create some problems with the h-file and bishop e4 coming. It's a very, very messy and complicated position, but I think, objectively speaking, black has no reason to complain. In any case, that's sort of this line, the Shirov variation. And there's a lot of complications to it, like we're seeing, but I think black's quite fine. I don't really think there's any other super aggressive moves here to organize g4. So basically, I guess since the video is a little shorter than I was expecting, I'll start to talk a little bit about the more positional lines. So essentially, if white's not going to play for checkmate, what his goal is going to be is to put a total clamp down on the move c5 and to try to eventually expand on the king side. So if I'm going to just show some moves where everything is going right for white, which is, obviously we're not going to just allow, but let's say something, I'm just going to make it so everything humanly possible goes well. So knight, bishop h7, g6, g3, bishop e7, and like knight d2, knight d7, a4, a6, a5, castle b4, and like rook c8, knight e1. So this is a position where everything possible has gone well for white. Basically, white is going to play f4 and h4 and h5, and he's going to expand on the king side, and black has no queenside counterplay. At this point, we are seeing that white's space advantage is going to prove to be a huge asset. Black can play f6 or something, but after f4, he's just worse. I mean, he can play f5 maybe to try to close everything down, but white has a million ways to try to make progress here. He can play c4 at some point, he can play queen b3 and prepare for c4 to open some lines. He can play for h4, h5, and then g4. You don't want any piece of this. This is exactly what we don't want to see. But what we will see is that in order to get to this position, black had to make a lot of moves that we could have potentially improved on. For example, most recently, if instead of rook c8, which did absolutely nothing, we play the move f6, already we're making a fight out of it, and I think black looks to have a very fine position. After like takes, bishop takes, and black will play e5 next, I see no reason for black to complain at all. In fact, he might even be slightly better already. His pieces will become very active very fast. So on other moves like a6, probably not necessary. He could maybe play a move like c5. This sort of h6, bishop h7 is definitely an idea, but after like castles, why anyone would put the knight on g6 instead of f5 is beyond me. So the point here basically is, if everything goes right for white, in the long run, black is going to be in some trouble, which is why we have to rely on some kind of counterplay or some kind of piece exchanges. If we can exchange a bunch of pieces, then the white space advantage won't be a problem. But in general, I believe that black should be fighting for counterplay with the move f6 or c5, or trying to exchange a lot of pieces. So there's a lot of ways white can approach this position, but as we'll see, in almost all of them, black is going to find ways to make counterplay, and in the ones where he's not like immediately doing something, then I don't think white's play is super dangerous. So, for example, there's a move like knight to d2. White's going to play knight to b3. His main idea with this move is prevent c5. And here, so far, it looks like he has prevented c5. But realistically, black can play c5 anyway. And I think I covered a game Kramnik-Leko in this variation. I think c5 is a little bit risky, but it's certainly playable. Black also can play knight d7 to play for c5. Like, I know there's some line that goes, like, knight f3, queen c7, bishop e2, castle long, castle short, and then black plays f6. So it just shows there's a lot of other ways to fight for control of the center. Another variation is going to be bishop e3, where white's trying to immediately put a clamp down on c5, and let's say e6, c3. Here, I think black does quite well to play queen b6. Queen b3, f6, f4, knight d7, and let's say like knight d2. I think black can play the move g5 here. And he's immediately trying to break down the white center that has been so proudly put together. In general, I'm saying that if white is going to play this sort of slow ideas, you want to make sure he can't like completely sit on you with his space advantage by either playing f6 or c5 to create some open lines and some counterplay. And if white plays like super aggressively with the moves like h4 and g4, I also sort of recommend a similar approach. Just don't take him at his word. Immediately fight back for the center. Because I believe in either case, white in the long run is going to have a very promising position. And that's why I think the advance is the most critical line, is because like black is dependent on having counterplay. Now, I do think in general he has enough. Like, I haven't really seen any like super convincing way to eliminate counterplay to the point that black just has an unpleasant position. But the point is, I think he needs that counterplay. And with that in mind, I think it's important for him to know what to do. And I also think it's the most critical line for white, because if he can find a way to eliminate that counterplay, strategically speaking, he will be better, which is not the case in the knight c3 main line or the Panov, where strategically speaking, the position is absolutely fine for black, and in some cases even black can be better. So in any case, that was sort of a little introduction at the end to the more positional lines. There's also the short variation with bishop e2, knight f3. Continue and possibly conclude, I haven't yet decided if I'm going to do some illustrative games, a series on the Caro Kann defense. So last time we got to sort of the less critical parts of the most critical line, which is the advanced variation, where white is playing aggressively with moves like h4, g4, and trying to like immediately kill you on the king side. I don't really think very much of those moves, and hopefully I gave an adequate antidote. What I do think is more dangerous is if white is going to play a more positional style, simply trying to sit on you. Like, there's a lot of ways where things can go badly wrong for black if white is just given free rein to advance and never deal with any counterplay. So he has a few main ways of doing this. He can play the move knight d2 to put the knight on b3. I've already covered this a little bit in the previous one. And with this move, he'll play knight b3. And by doing so, he's trying to really put a clamp down on the move c5 to make it very hard for black to play this way. He can play bishop e3, also with the idea of putting a clamp down, or he can play knight f3, bishop e2, which is sort of the short variation. But all of these are sort of the idea of making white's position as solid as possible to be as, counterplay proof as they can be, and then in the long run, his space advantage should tell the tale, is sort of how the logic behind white's setup. So I think we'll start with the least critical one first, which is bishop e3. And here, which I almost completed this in the last one because it doesn't take much effort. But the real point is after e6, c3, white's doing everything he can to prevent c5, but oftentimes what you'll find is if white puts a ton of effort into making c5 not playable, oftentimes f6 will gain strength. In general, I think c5 is a more effective measure for counterplay because f6 can often create like a backward e6 pawn and whatnot. But I think that here, if white really puts every effort into blocking c5, then f6 becomes a lot more powerful. So here I'd recommend queen b6 to put pressure on the b2 pawn. Okay, b4, a5 would already be a disaster for white. I think black's much better already. So white needs to defend this guy. He can play queen c1 or he can play queen b3. Or I suppose queen d2, but that looks a little awkward. If he plays queen c1, I think c5 is probably the best way to go here. White tried to play bishop e3 and c3 to stop c5, and, well, you got it in anyway, and we're going to play knight c6 and have a good position. So more critical is queen b3. Now c5 would not be desirable because after takes, white would win a pawn. We're not able to capture back because b7 is going to hang and you're going to have problems. So here, though, I'd recommend playing f6 with the idea to immediately try to attack the white center. So white could play a move like f4, which is the main idea, and now knight d7. And black is going to play g5, and he's going to do it very quickly. He's going to try to do everything he can to break down the white center as much as humanly possible. I had a game in this position against Daniel Naroditsky. He went like knight d2, g5, knight f3, and here like takes. And in general, there's a few ways to approach this position. In the game, I played bishop h6, which I think is a decent move, but I also think bishop g7 is quite playable. The point is, black is really trying to destroy the white center at its seams so that he doesn't have to deal with the long-run prospect of sort of biting on granite of the white space advantage. And yeah, like my game went bishop h6, takes. I think I played knight f7 here instead of maybe I captured. We got something like this, and I think black had a totally fine position. Now you can look up that game in the database. If you want to see how to play the opening well and then play the rest of the game horribly, just look at both of our play this game. We played the game like a couple of monkeys. But in any case, I think the opening went totally fine, and black looks like a good position. Bishop g7 is also quite playable. Black's putting pressure on the center. He can even castle short, but more likely he'll castle long. And I think he has a totally fine and acceptable position. So that's not really an issue. If white plays like, I guess, knight d2, g5, g3, black can just go like takes, and probably strong with his bishop h6 now, looking for some pins. And white he still has his strong center, but black has very obvious counterplay with connected with sort of the pin to the bishop on e3, putting pressure on the f4 pawn with like knight e7, rook f8, knight g6. I mean, the space advantage, the real reason the space advantage is good is because it restricts the opponent's pieces, but in this case it's so abundantly clear that black's pieces are just better than white's that I don't think the space advantage is relevant at all. Very combative, but I do recommend playing combatively when white is playing the advance. That's not really an issue. Much more challenging are the moves knight d2 and knight f to b3 and the knight f3 short variation style. So if these go wrong for black, he can often have a very unpleasant position. Like I remember some game, like for example, a game played by Carlsen. It was like knight f3 and then like bishop e3. This is against Wang Hao, I believe. Bishop g6, knight d2, and then I think it was like knight d7 here, bishop e2, and black played knight to e7, which I think was a pretty serious mistake, but if he plays like knight h6, which I think is the best move, he has a fine position. The problem with knight e7 was that white played knight h4. And already here, black's counterplay is extremely limited. So the game continued, c5, c3, knight c6, take, white played knight f3. Already, strategically, I think black is in enormous trouble in this position because he doesn't have any clear plan to make progress on the queen side, especially without that white-squared bishop. Well, white has the very clear plan to play h4, knight g5, h5, and Carlsen completely destroyed Wang Hao. Not good news. We don't want any piece of that. So it sort of shows that, like, if white is able to restrict counterplay, even by allowing c5 but making it inconsequential, you don't want any piece of that. And you also don't want to get this structure with, like, losing the bishop for that pawn and the bad pawn structure. There's definitely problems that could be had. And also white can play bishop e2, which is, I think, probably the most challenging move because it's the most flexible. But we'll see that there's a solution. So let's start with knight d2, which I think is the least critical. And then e6, knight b3. There have been a lot of games where black's playing like knight d7 here, and then after knight f3, he's playing c5. And I think this line is critical. It's interesting. Takes, and then he takes with a bishop, strong move, because taking with a knight is just bad news. If like bishop b5 check, you're going to run into trouble somehow. c4 is coming. So taking with the bishop is better. And then, like, takes, and check is not a problem because we can just drop the knight back this time. And c4, we can just play a6, and black's quite fine. Giving up that knight on b3 is a certain asset for us. But white's doing some, like, I think he's doing some kind of bishop e3, and then there's, like, I don't know, it's like queen c7. I forget exactly. I think this line's fine for black, but I'm going to recommend something a little different. In this case, I'm going to recommend that black plays a positional setup, which goes, let's say, knight f3, and then I want knight e7. So I just sort of said that I didn't like this move because of knight h4, but I think this is different in this case because white is not as prepared to play it as he would be if he had played bishop e2 and bishop e3 instead of, like, knight b1 to d2 to b3. Here I think black can play the move bishop to e4, and he can meet f3 with probably the easiest is knight g6, and I think the tactics are favoring black. He has no reason to fear this position. And if he's able to maintain the bishop on g6 here, I think he'll have no problems at all. For example, bishop e2, c5. Already black is quite fine. So, in general, I think sort of trying to use, like, these tactics to help you out is helpful. So let's say white plays bishop e2. And now here I'm going to recommend that black drops the knight back to c8. So with this move, the reason that I'm going to recommend playing this way now as opposed to later where I think this is actually is not the most accurate is because white, having put the knight on b3, has significantly weakened the c4 square. And after something like castles, bishop e7, let's say bishop e3, castles, and white plays like a4. This is a pretty typical variation, but white has already put the knight on b3, which is a certain concession. And here I'm going to recommend playing the move knight cb6. Now, normally, like, this would just get hit by a5 when the white knight is back on d2, and it would look silly. But here the point is a5, we can play knight c4. And I think black has a very comfortable position. For example, takes, knight d2, b5, and I see no problems at all. A takes b6, knight takes b6. The pawn structure looks a little superficial, but realistically, black's going to put the queen on d5, and I think black might even be slightly better already. His pieces are going to be very well placed. So, basically, I think that, to sum up, I think that if white plays a knight to b3 setup, what black should do is play knight e7 back to c8. Now, normally, as we'll see, I'm not going to recommend this. It's only when white plays knight b3, so keep this in mind. Another possibility is queen c7, bishop e2, and now, like, f6, castles, and it's very messy. I do not trust this for black. I looked into a little bit. I think white has good chances for an advantage. Black can get himself into trouble if he's not careful here. So, like, I think that black has to capture on e5 here and then takes, and like it's like knight takes e5, and now either knight to d4 is very challenging. I think black could get himself into trouble if he's not careful. So, I mean, that's certainly feasible. You can look into it, but I would not recommend it. I think that's going too far. So, this knight e7 to c8 idea, I think, is very strong. Next up is sort of the Carlsen type variation, knight f3, e6, bishop e3, and let's say knight d7, bishop e2. Here I'm going to recommend that move, knight h6, which we saw a second ago. Basically, the point of this move is, we're playing bishop g6 first. This is a very common idea, by the way, is to play bishop g6, because we want to play knight h6 and put the knight on f5. I think white, having already played bishop e3, makes this bishop g6 move extremely effective. So, for example, like knight d2, which was seen in the Carlsen game. Here, knight e7 was played. It's a mistake. Black should play knight h6, and he'll put the knight on f5, and I think black is quite fine. Basically, in order to assess these positions properly, you need to assess the ramifications of white capturing on h6. Now, in this case, I think it's very clear that black is doing well because he can play f6 and c5 very, very quickly. For example, let's say castles, either bishop g7, preparing f6, and then castle short is quite fine. Say like rook e1, f6, takes, I don't know, bishop f1, and like castle short. Black will very quickly play rook e8 and e5, and he's got a very fine position. The pawn structure detriment on the king side is easily compensated by the bishop pair in the big center for black that's soon to be emerging. You don't have any reason to worry here. So, however, if white is able to make this happen without counterplay, the game is more or less over in the long run. So you have to make sure you're getting that counterplay quickly. And we're going to see, I think this is why the short variation is the most critical. We're seeing knight d2 to b3, we can play knight e7 to c8, and if there's bishop e3 early, we can play this knight h6 move. But the short variation, I think, is the most critical line. Because if black plays this same kind of positional setup with knight d7, castles, and say bishop g6, which I think, by the way, I think this is certainly reasonable, but it's not, like, amazing. I think white has some chances for an advantage here. His only move to fight for an edge, I believe, is c3. In this case, I believe knight h6 is going to lead to a better position for white. Because we're not wasting that key tempo. Like, we need to find, basically, what white wants to do is meet knight h6 with bishop takes h6, but he wants to not waste the tempo here. Like, if he plays, for example, bishop e3 like we saw before, black plays like bishop e7, I think like black will just play, or well, here maybe queen d2. No, but just knight h6, and black should have a very fine position. But after white playing c3 instead, we're using this key tempo to control the d4 square. And after knight h6, let's say takes. I think after knight d2, white will be better here. Basically, the point is, if black plays on the king side with like bishop e7, this was not working. Like rook e1, and if f6, this was too slow somehow. I think it's like takes, and now knight f1, and white's playing knight e3 and having a very good position. I think this is right. But in general, this is the most critical line. Another move white can play here, by the way, is knight to e1. Point is to meet f6 with f4. And he'll play bishop d3, and I think white has a nice position. So you don't want any piece of that. I mean, it's not terrible for black, but I do think that white will have better chances. So we need to find some other way to organize our pieces. So basically, there's two main options here. Black can play c5, which is very combative, or he can try to find another setup involving like developing the knights slowly and whatnot. For example, there's a more sharp alternative with the move knight e7, and I've always been meaning to look into this move, and then I think it's like castles c5, and they're playing like c4, knight c6, dc, d4, and it's complicated. I've always told myself I should look into this, but thus far I've been way too lazy. So that's a feasible line. You should look into it. I would teach it, but I would feel bad about it because I'm not qualified to teach it. c5 immediately is a critical move. I will warn you with caution that it's risky, but I do think black is okay. After bishop e3, black has a couple options. He can capture on d4 and then play knight e7, and he's hoping to play knight b to c6. Knight takes f5, knight takes f5 should never bother him. And he's hoping to play knight b c6. I'm not going to get into every single move here just because it would take too long. What I will say is I believe black is absolutely fine in every single variation except for knight to d2. Knight c6, knight f3. I think this is quite challenging. Basically, the last time I looked into this line, I found that the variation I was trying to play was not working very well. I thought that white was finding a way to get an advantage. So I have seen games recently in this line and played by fine players with improvements. I will suggest looking into this line yourself. I'm going to say that this is the only critical variation that white has. I think every single line is absolutely fine for black, except for this one. This one is unclear, if white is going to get an advantage or not. There's been some moves played here that have been interesting. Like, I remember the one time I had this position, I played bishop e4, and then, like, castles, knight g6. This position, I think, is okay. Knight g5, knight capture on e5, f4, and here I played knight takes d4. What did I play here? Yeah, I played knight takes d4, which was a mistake, but after bishop c5, black is quite happy. But there was some line here. Knight takes e4, d takes e4, c3, and logically I couldn't make any sense of this, but practically I just played around with the computer for a long time and I could not find equality for black to save my life. Now, I would not be surprised if equality does exist, but it's something you should look into yourself. So this line, it's risky. I'd recommend the move queen b6 here, which is, again, sort of the grab the bull by the horn strategy. Just like, I do not care. Like, play as risky as possible. I think that this is the way to go because white in the advance often is better. And here, after knight c3, queen takes b2, we've got some insanity. There's like knight b5 as a move, and then there's like c4, knight c7, and white's up a rook, but the knight is going to get trapped, and black's like capturing on c2, and something like bishop a3. Black's got two very strong connected queenside pawns, and the knight on a8 is kind of a goner. This line I think is quite good for black, but there's still a lot of room for improvements. More critical for white is the move queen to b1 here, which creates more insanity. Like, queen c3 is not possible on account of bishop d2 with taking on b7 coming. There's other moves like queen c2 fails to queen b5, and then rook c1. And white is, I think, just winning. Black probably has to capture here. And now there's, I think c4 is critical, rook takes b7, and it's a very complicated position. Intuitively, I think black should be okay. But I think it's risky. The alternative I'm going to give you is less risky, and that's the move knight c6. So I think this is quite reasonable. I haven't yet been able to find a clear advantage for white. White can play knight a4 and after check c3, c4, and this position is interesting. A computer will never help you at all. It's sort of a closed structure, but I think that black is fine. Let's say like b4 was not like, yeah, b4 capturing is interesting, very interesting. In fact, wait, like there's like captures, takes, king f1, and now like b5, knight b2, and strong move bishop a3, which shuts down a4. I remember the computer was giving white a pretty large advantage here, but I think, I might be confusing myself, but I'm pretty sure the computer was giving a clear edge for white. But I was not sure at all. I thought black, like, I think the computer was saying bishop c1 was the best move to meet like queen c3 with queen d2, but I looked at this position and I was not sure at all that white was better at all. I mean, it looks like, I could be confusing myself, but I'm pretty sure this was the position I saw, and I thought that black was actually doing quite fine despite being down to pieces. Pawns are very good and the white pieces are garbage, especially rook on h1, just not playing the game. So, yeah, I mean, this c4 move I think is quite critical. More common for white instead of b4, I think, is to castle. Yeah, come to think of it, I think after b4, knight b4, black is better. But here, black just plays like b5, knight c5, and let's say like takes, knight e7, and they're like playing like b4, queen back to c7. I think this position's totally fine for black. I didn't see any serious issues. There's some complications, but strategically speaking, I think black has every reason to be happy. And again, this is a nice one because if someone's trying to play like really aggressively and using the computer for help, the computer will not be giving any important aid in this position at all. I think black's absolutely fine. So this would be my main recommendation in the c5 variation. And I think that this knight c6 move is very fine for black. There have been some good games. So the other alternative I'm going to give you is a way to play a more slow positional game, which is knight d7 and now castles. And like we were seeing, I thought that after bishop g6, c3, white was getting a slightly better position. But I do think c3 is the only move, and it's very hard to figure out. A computer will never do it. It's got to be a human. I saw an annotated game from the position after bishop g6, and it didn't mention c3 as the best move. It just gave it as possible and didn't say it was best or anything. I would not be surprised if a lot of people have no idea that after bishop g6, c3 is the only try for an edge. But even still, if you want to play some alternate way, I'm going to recommend the move h6. And with this move, you're going to play knight e7, bishop h7, and knight f5. And I think black is doing reasonably there. It's a little bit artificial, but I think it's fine. Like, let's say knight d2, knight e7. I don't know what white wants to play, but like, let's say knight b3. Well, if knight b3, we can even play knight back to c8, but we do lose a tempo here on this h6 move that we normally wouldn't have played. But let's say white plays, I don't know, like b3, and he's going to play c4. Black can just play bishop h7, c4, knight f5, and I think this position should be okay for him. I didn't see anything super convincing for white. Black will play bishop e7, knight h4. He should be okay. And if white really ignores you, like let's say white plays, I don't know, like a4 and tries to like do this typical like a5 stuff. I don't know if it's quite right here, but one thing to keep in mind, it's not always playable. In fact, it usually isn't. But if white really messes with you and like says, you know, I'm just not going to ignore I'm going to ignore your play completely, you can consider the move g5 to play bishop g7 and like immediately strike him with f6. This is often coupled with a queenside castle. But it is risky, so keep that in mind. In any case, I think this h6, bishop h7, knight e7 is the best way to go against the short variation if you want to avoid the c5 confrontational lines, which I don't think is necessary. I think those lines are okay for black. But just to give a brief overview, going back to this critical position after knight f3, if white plays sort of Carlsen style with bishop e2, bishop e3, you want to play the bishop g6, knight h6 line. If white plays the knight d2 to b3 line, I'd recommend the knight e7 to c8 to b6 line. And if white plays the short variation, I'd recommend either the h6 bishop h7 or the like super combative c5. In any case, I think that'll conclude my entire series on at least the opening theory part of the Caro Kann. I've covered a fair amount of games in the Caro Kann from my own experience on chess.com. I'm sure you can look that up and you'll find some. Like I've covered at least a few in the Panov, a couple in the mainline, and probably just one in the advanced. But anyhow, there have been enough games, and I hope you enjoyed the series and are now ready to play the Caro Kann in your real games. So if there's any, I know I've gotten a lot of requests for this series. It's finally done, and hopefully it was satisfying.